It's my honor and privilege to introduce Dorothy Berry, Digital Curator at Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. I want to thank the Price Lab staff for all the work they did getting things set up. Stephen Perez is in the back. Pamela Horn also took care of travel arrangements and things like that. I should also thank the Center for Africana Studies here at Penn, especially Isaiah Gaiman, who had to take off. He really coordinated most of the room stuff, so huge thanks to them. When I was thinking about this talk, I kept coming back to how some of the deepest roots of digital humanities are actually in digital collections. And I was thinking back, in the 90s when a lot of archivists were like, it'd be really cool if we could digitize these collections and put them up on this internet that everyone seems to be excited about. And that would be awesome because people wouldn't have to travel to come see us, and frankly, they won't touch our fragile stuff quite so often. It turns out there are actually some downsides to doing that as well. Digital archives are kind of expensive, and also no one really knows how digital preservation works yet. But as soon as we figure that out, I'm sure it'll be fine. But beyond the financial and technical questions, there were some much deeper questions that demanded our attention. Physical archives are not, have never been, and will never be neutral. We look for the lives of women and the archives of their husbands. We look for the lives of enslaved people and the archives of enslavers. And how did this stuff wind up in the archive anyway? There's a lot of questions there. The advent of the digital archive challenges us to confront that legacy and to do better, to approach this task thoughtfully and with care. So we're really lucky that Dorothy is on the job. Not because, and she'll be happy to point this out, not because she has all the solutions and not because she has all the answers, but because she speaks up when she sees a problem, when she sees a challenge. And she writes, as she writes in her amazing essay, The House Archives Built, for me, the anxiety around blunt speech is less harmful than the guilt of keeping quiet. So with that, I'm going to be quiet and pass the mic on to Dorothy.
Thank you all so much for coming out tonight, especially when it's a pretty gross day outside. I also want to thank all of my colleagues at Penn who arranged this talk. Believe me when I say, completely without humility and not at all trying to be self-effacing, that I'm genuinely shocked every time that the idea that anyone might want to listen to me comes up, let alone colleagues and emerging scholars from across disciplines. I initially conceived this talk under the impression that I would primarily be speaking to students in Africana Studies department as something of a career talk. While that audience has shifted, the initial theme remains the core of this talk, if only as a needed structure. The talk is a work in progress in many ways, bringing together a variety of threads I've been working on over the past couple of years, moving towards, I hope, a more cohesive argument. Hopefully, question and answers will do even more work to bring and refine those ideas. In the summer, I started a new position as a digital curator for the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And around the same time, I had a conversation with my colleague Ashley Clark, who is the head of editorial for Criterion Collection. We commiserated about a shared experience. We both receive a good amount of cold calls from Black students and early career folks asking a very fair question. How did you get your job? With the equally fair implication, how do I get your job? This is a commiseration not because that's a bad question, but because of our shared answer. Work incredibly hard and coincidentally have incredible good luck. The hard work without the luck, circumstance, serendipity, whatever word you like, wouldn't lead to these jobs. And the luck without the hard work doesn't make the job sustainable. If I had heard that at any point of my career before now, I might have deflated the very moment he said that. I have been distinctly unlucky for long periods of time. I've had social, genetic, and self-made roadblocks that definitely hindered my growth. The best I can say is that at any given point, I did keep going. This has become something I'm examining more and more as I transition into my time as a mid-career professional and realize that not only do I not want to be a I did this the hard way and so should you type person, I sometimes even hesitate to explain how I did things because I want to add a codicil. I did it this way, and it was terrible. And it really stressed me out, and it made me mad and mean for years. But look at me now. I have health insurance. These thoughts resonate to me under the feminist theory of an ethics of care, something I've learned about in the archives field primarily through osmosis of the work by friends and colleagues like Elvia Arroyo Ramirez and Holly Smith, as admittedly, I am absolutely terrible at actually deep reading theory. A dear friend once said that generally I am quite autodidactic with theory. That's all to say there is a greater depth to ethics of care than I know, but for me in my professional life, it's about caring for the people whose stories I've been tasked to steward, caring for the people who've been doing that stewardship before I arrived and those who work alongside me, and caring for myself as I do that stewardship work. I'm excited to talk with all of you about care-centered views on archives, digital history, and digital humanities, because I think at this point, that is the most valuable perspective I have to offer. At the end of 2022, I was at a dinner where the concept of archival imaginaries came up. Someone at the dinner said they loved the idea of archival imaginaries and that institutions should do more work imagining the space between the records and filling in those spaces with creative visions of the past. I said that I'm wary of that work because at the core of it is using real people to tell fictional stories, which is a very heavy task. The first person said, "Well, what do you think about the work of Saidiya Hartman then?" And I replied that her work is fantastic and is deeply grounded in a depth of archival research that provides a solid foundation to her critical theorizing, but that her own coinage, critical fabulation, is clear on the face about being fabulation. Even more recently, at the American Historical Association annual meeting, I was on a panel that received an interesting question during the Q&A portion about periodization. A co-panelist was discussing Revolutionary City, a digital collections project from the American Philosophical Society working with peer institutions to digitize primary sources about Philadelphia's role as a revolutionary city from 1774 to 1783. An attendee raised a question about the choice of that period. Another attendee raised a question about Philadelphia's centrality as a revolutionary city. The conversation was bouncing between archival description and digital discovery and early America and the New Republic, centering at a point about how historians make arguments. Philadelphia is more key than Boston because XYZ, and starting in 1770 would actually better capture the revolutionary city because ABC. I wasn't deeply paying attention. But oftentimes, practical constraints are what actually shape our work. We have access and support to amazing Philadelphia collections. We are in Philadelphia. Or we have to put time-based boundaries on this project because we want to complete it. I jumped in with a mention of how I've made similar decisions myself and received the very fair question. Why would you do primary sources about African American history from the 18th century to the 1920s? Why stop and end there with the expectation that there was a really deep and powerful idea about what that period in Black life means? And the frankest response is simply that the earliest material in my collection was from the 18th century, and I stopped in the 1920s because I didn't want to deal with copyright. That is less of a historical argument and more of a practical project plan, but it brought up a point that I think is key when thinking about caring for the past in digital history work, being clear about how and when you are making an argument. I don't think anybody here, or I hope not, would be particularly surprised or argumentative about those common slogans. Archives are not neutral, museums are not neutral, and certainly universities are not neutral. I personally don't particularly believe in human objectivity in any context, but the question becomes to me, what and when are we making arguments? I guess what and when arguments are we making and tacitly accepting, and how do they interact with our work, especially interdisciplinarily? Archival silences are a useful concept for some types of research. When scholars discussing the conceptual Derrida Foucaultian archives, like I said, very autodidactic with it, as heard by that pronunciation of the last name, how does that concept feel, though, when it's repeated back from within actually existing archives? Does the concept feel as valid when archivists and curators talk about the silences in the very collections that they handle acquisitions for? We know there are silences around women and Black people. Becomes a politically neutralizing phrase that absolves the institution. We know there are silences, but who knows how they got there? Filling in those silences brings us to an even more fraught situation. Now that we are not just making conceptual arguments, we're making arguments about real people. This is not at all an intrinsic negative. Making arguments about actual people is a huge part of a scholar's job. When we think about trust in institutions in digital history, the question becomes, are we dehumanizing the historical subject in service of our argument? The gift of historical imagination comes with a heavy responsibility when creating public works. What you imagined becomes someone else's facts. When Saidiya Hartman presents a heartrending view of Black women's life in the early 20th century Philadelphia through the lens of an erotically posed Black child in a photograph from the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, it is both with her deep human empathy and her deep archival research. The essay gets published in The New Yorker with a particular audience and shared around social media circles that vet and respect that platform for whom The New Yorker means something. On the far opposite end of that spectrum, a tweet with an unsourced black and white photo of a Black man and woman in formal dress posed for a portrait is captioned with some pablum about how we used to be more respectable and stay together in marriage, and has 10,000 likes and 5,000 quote tweets, half agreeing with the point and half calling it out for respectability politics. Somewhere in a Google image search, that same photo links back to a digital collection at an institution where it's factually described as a photograph of a brother and sister, having nothing to do with the viral recontextualization. As I said, these are obviously two ends of a historical interpretation spectrum, and it may feel disrespectful to refer to the latter in the same breath as the former. Stewarding the past, though, means a responsibility to interacting with how our publics and communities receive their histories. With digital history in particular, we have an opportunity to translate more complicated historical theorizations into more digestible digital storytelling, but always with the concern. Do we contextualize, simplify, narrate history in ways that our subjects would recognize? I can imagine that subjects of Hartman's fabulation could see themselves, or at very least see people they know in her tellings. And I can imagine also that the subjects of a viral photograph might feel pretty annoyed to know that people 150 years later thought their family photo was an example of a great romance. Caring for the people whose stories I've been tasked to steward, or caring for the past, is key to my understanding of archival work and digital work that engages with historical subjects. Recognizing that historical subjects share an equal humanity with contemporary subjects like you and I seems like a straightforward and potentially obvious task, but it plays into our ethics in complicated manners. Interpreting the past means making an argument, and it is all too easy to put the importance of one's argument ahead of the humanity of the historical subjects being used as evidence. This sort of care should be core to all historical thinking, but it is especially key when working with the evidence of people who we know were marginalized, oppressed, abused by institutions and by society in their living days. Using those people, whether as stories, as jumping off points, as data points, is a major responsibility that requires self-awareness and care. Valuing the humanity and agency of historical figures goes hand in hand with seeking humanity for our peers and colleagues. Now, this is another sticky area because academic and cultural heritage fields seem to be full of two divergent messages. Look out only for you and yours because this is a zero-sum game and we are already working at a disadvantage as marginalized people trying to be heard. And on the other hand, be strategically obsequious because networking and getting out there are the only possibilities for success in a zero-sum game where you make your own luck. What's unfortunate, or at the very least to reuse the earlier word sticky, is that neither of those messages is particularly wrong. There are people in the field, I can be extremely broad here and say the field because I think it's an interdisciplinary truth, who appear to be only focused on themselves and are happy to use you as a stepping stone and who are incredibly successful in their careers. There are also people who in the field who value the ability to make small talk and charm over over the quality of their work, whether subconsciously or not. And some of those people are also deeply successful. There's been a lot of discussion about the relative pros and cons of assuming good intent. Even with the implied ending of until proven otherwise, many of us have backgrounds and cultural knowledge that teach us that the otherwise is already proven to a certain extent. I want to be clear that this is not the direction I'm going in here, both because I'm not sure of the efficacy of that argument, and because as far as I know, no one came here to listen to a motivational speaker. What I do think of is of value professionally speaking, is assuming everyone you interact with is as complexly human as you are, which means that though it's not always your job to puzzle them out, everyone you are interacting with has motives which seem as reasonable to them as yours do to you. Community is a buzzword in archives and digital history. Every grant you review these days has at least one line about community history or community archives. I was recently talking with a colleague, a fantastic archivist with great expertise in environmental sustainability for cultural heritage. We were joking about a strange trend. Both of us have often been asked to engage or lead or write about community archives, in spite of the fact that neither of us have ever done any work in community archives and have worked for fairly large and sometimes objectively gross institutions in our careers. I came to recognize a few years ago that community serves as a grand signifier for a lot of cultural heritage organizations. Bringing in the community, getting community members to describe materials, asking the community what they'd like to see from our programming. All of these phrases imply a sort of care for those who have stewarded materials before and beyond institutions, but are so amorphous as to make any actual work impossible. Many times in my professional life, when colleagues at predominantly white institutions have approached me about community archives or working with the community, the core of the question is, how can we get a black stamp of approval on our work? Or perhaps below the surface, how can we preemptively respond to complaints about our work by making it clear that we asked some Black people's opinions? Caring about these stewards, our peers and colleagues, think of that sentence either with a comma or an em-dash because they both work, means ensuring that we are only bringing people into our work that we can fairly compensate and represent, and accepting that that might mean our initial goals are not feasible. Working with the community is a huge responsibility, but also means a necessary willingness to let go of power. There are many stories like the one that follows, but when I was in graduate school, I took a course on museum curation with a really great professor, Jason Jackson. He told us about a time when he had first graduated and was working with a Native American tribe in Oklahoma to design an exhibition of woven baskets. Jackson, being fresh out of school and finally in charge for once, though working with the community, proposed an innovative exhibition that challenged traditional gallery showings and presented the baskets in an entirely unexpected way. The response was less than positive. What folks wanted was exactly what he was trying to move away from: a traditional gallery show, things in vitrines, lines of photographs on the wall. The response from the community was something along the lines of, "We know what an exhibition is. Do you not think our material is worthy of what an exhibition is?" He learned a lesson that day about the humility that is foundational to bringing institutional knowledge and power into conversation with community cultural stewards. I have seen similar lessons with digital history projects, where excited scholars have big ideas about creating a post-custodial archive on a new open source platform to broadly share the histories of an under-examined community, only to find upon actually meeting with those community stewards that what they really want is a private Facebook group on local history, where they can share scans of old photos with each other and reminisce. I am not saying that there is no value in trying to innovate even within contexts like this, and I am pointedly not trying to say that all communities are old-fashioned or low-tech or that they veer away from experimentation. What I am saying, though, is that caring for the present, caring for those who've stewarded materials before and being in conversation with them now, requires humility of us as scholars and archivists, digital humanists, and even more than humility, a willingness to let go of power that has often been quite hard-earned. The hard-earned part, to me, is key for caring for the future, and by the future, I mean you. Self-care has veered far from Audre Lorde's teachings and into a realm of pastel-textured affirmations on Instagram and consumerist invocations on TikTok. I am less interested in discussing that topic, that concept, and more interested in closing out by acknowledging that doing work in archives in digital history that engages and celebrates and shares especially Black cultural heritage is, at least in my experience, hard-earned in a way that requires a degree of care for self. It goes back to the addendum that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, not wanting to be a person who is, this is how I did it, and it was kind of terrible. It is a real gift to be able to work with the material history of Black people, and to have the extended opportunity to work to make that history broadly accessible through visualization, digital collection development, data analysis, exhibition. The responsibility of that gift can be overwhelming, especially in predominantly white institutions, where generously uninformed and less generously completely indifferent colleagues view your work as a hobby field within the larger realm of what they perceive to be important. I have repeatedly had the experience of colleagues who, by rights, should be my prime collaborators, but who completely ignored my work as racialized side projects to the general mission of history and literature. Juicy though it may be, or it definitely would be, this is not the moment where the talk delves into all the hot gossip of racist interactions at various institutions. The experiences are not institution-specific or specific to any individual cultural heritage worker. They are the consequence of challenging an established order, and there is an argument that those unsightly cracks are necessary to topple the flawed foundation. This sort of cerebral response is useful in a way, but it's not at all a salve when you are working hard with little support. Caring for yourself in these situations is important because of all the affirmations I maligned just a moment ago. If you create some good work while destroying your health, was it worth it? I can't answer that for you, but I'd say in most cases, probably not. Your particular insights are needed as contributions to the broader conversation, and that becomes even more clear to me over time. Much like the earlier note about how everyone, even a little bit progressive, gets asked to work in community archives, I'm also frequently asked about disability archives, about expansive gender and sexuality archives, areas that I've read enough about to not be completely ignorant, but that I can also firmly say I should not take leadership in. Sometimes caring for yourself and honoring the responsibility of your gift is leaning into the discomfort of acknowledging the things that are not your gift. The Academy is designed to make us afraid of limitations, and that can be compounded by having an identity that is already assumed by those empowered to be lesser. Limitations can be perceived as weakness. Taking pride in the things you know and learning to collaborate with folks who know the things you don't is the opposite of weakness. Care is a strength and leads to knowledge. Care can feel like an amorphous concept, and I know my words paint in the abstract as opposed to photorealism. Care for humanity and history and community and in ourselves is a responsibility that comes with the gift of stewardship. I recently read an interview with a friend of mine that was in a magazine series on the day-to-day life of different artists. In talking about his practice, he said that he feels that it's key to honor the responsibility that comes with having your own personal gift. Because I really do think that each of us has a gift. That's what follow your bliss means. It doesn't mean just drink ayahuasca all day. Follow your bliss means to honor the responsibility of a gift. Working with history, especially working with Black history, is a gift. Honoring the responsibility of that gift means developing an ethic of care. I want to thank everyone again for coming tonight, and give special thanks to my colleagues at Penn Dream Lab and the Center for Africana Studies, for my friends and colleagues Rebecca Fassman at the Kinsey Institute of Sexual Research and Betts Cope at Harvard's Houghton Library for reviewing this talk, and for all the thinkers and stewards who've come before me. And I look forward to talking with you all about what you just thought. Thanks.